My name is Nick Euler. I am with the City of Memphis. I'm in our Division of Engineering. And I am the manager for this project that we're here tonight to talk about and to share a lot of work with you. So I just want to give a quick introduction to the project, and then I will hand it off to a colleague who will give about a 15-minute presentation or so. We'll continue on with the music and the rest of the evening. So this project, what we're calling the Better Streets Project, is streets plural because it's actually a pretty massive project. It's about an 8-mile-long corridor, 8-9-mile-long corridor stretching from Chelsea and Watkins up north in North Memphis, going all the way south to Brooks and Watkins-Presley Boulevard in South Memphis. That includes segments of Watkins, Cleveland, right outside the doors here. Cleveland, I think it was a car. Indian. There we go. Cleveland, Peabody, Bellevue, and Elvis-Presley Boulevard. This is an important corridor for the city because it's one of our few corridors in this part of the town that's really a north-south running route. The way Memphis has developed over the years was from west to east, so we have a lot of streets moving along that axis, but fewer that go this way. There's been a lot of work and a lot of momentum happening around this corridor in recent years, and I think it's just going to build up in the years ahead. This is also a corridor that touches on very diverse neighborhoods. You travel through here, you're passing through all walks of life in Memphis. And also from an opportunities and challenges standpoint, a very diverse corridor in terms of what the problems are and what the opportunities are and how we can change things. So this project kicked off about 6 months ago or so. In that time, we have been meeting one-on-one with stakeholders. We've been going out on the street. We've ridden bikes. We've ridden buses. We walked it. We actually, some of us jogged it last night in triple-digit temperatures. I was not one of them, but Godspeed to those who did it. Very, very impressive. We'll be gaining information from residents, from stakeholders, and I've talked to literally a few hundred individuals over the last 6 months in total so far. And all that really was leading up to this week. It's been a 1-week design workshop, what we call a charrette. So the last few days, it's been kind of a hyped up, accelerated version, getting more meetings, going out in the community. We had some folks actually go out to different places in the community with this pop-up bus shelter. It was a great tool, a great interaction, and got people's attention. Spoke to just a couple hundred people just using this in the last 2 days. We actually even had MATA unofficially reinstall a bus stop sign at a location where this was, based off of a request while we were out there. I'm not sure if that's really sanctioned, but it happened. So what we're doing tonight is presenting the results of all of this outreach, kind of giving you a summary of what we have heard to date, and then also based on that summary, what our proposals are, our draft proposals to how to improve the corridor. So it's kind of creating this very high-level vision for the corridor to guide development, to guide investments from a public perspective. And then the next step after this week is to move forward with prioritizing that investment and eventually getting to design and construction in the years ahead. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. A few other items to mention before I hand it over here. Number one, we are actually recording this. It's going to be up online. So if you know somebody who wasn't able to make it, you can point them towards our website, memphis.com. Get information there. All the information, the boards you see, the presentation will be available online. It can be shared as well. And let's see what else do I want to say. Last thing. I've done a lot of public meetings in my career to date, either running them, being part of them, attending them. And if I may say so, I think this might be the coolest one yet. With food, drinks, we got music. So I just want to congratulate and thank everyone on the project team who worked on this. Thank you. And if you could actually just raise your hand so we know who you are, any of the consultants. Say Sept. Don't be shy. And again, that's who you need to talk to if you have any questions later on. So, with that, I want to turn it over to Joe, who is going to lead through this presentation. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Let's start with a confession. How many people came for the music? Yeah. Well, why we have you, we might as well talk about the plan, too. So as Nick mentioned, the team's been camped out in this space for the past week, meeting with people, developing drawings, testing options, seeing what works, what doesn't. And tonight we're going to walk through a presentation that we put together in the last few hours that attempts to summarize everything that we learned and where we think we're going from a set of recommendations standpoint. And what we hope this experience this week yields is a framework for making decisions for over the course of many months as the concepts and specific projects that will go out and get built get finalized. It's been the metaphor I've been using this week is this process is like a booster rocket. And then after this process, the stage 2 rockets will kick in and you'll start to see some real changes and that kind of stuff happening along the corridor. So let's get into it. We're gonna give you a brief presentation, and then most of the dialogue and kind of looking into the details will happen after I'm done speaking at the specific exhibits around the room. So what is this project all about? Really at its core is how can we make our streets better? Well, better means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. For one, we want to make it safer. Safer for pedestrians getting hit by cars, bikes, all users of the street feel welcome and safe using the street. Part of the way we make it safer is to make it more walkable, more breathable, more comfortable, and more livable. But one thing that we've really come to appreciate after spending a week along the corridor is that how do we do all that for every single Memphian that's using the street? That is at the core of everything that we are doing. And so that's the project, that's why we're here, that's what we're setting out to do. Nick gave you an overview of what this project entails in terms of the scope. All I'm going to do on this map is orient you because we've turned north to the right. This is the view that we're going to look at for the rest of the evening, starting with Watkins-Presley to your left, ending up north at Chelsea along North Watkins. So Nick gave a really good summary of the process. I'll just put out one kind of soundbite that over the course of this week and the time leading up to this week, we've had over 1,000 interactions in total that have fueled and guided this process throughout. The overarching theme that came out of that work is that this is not just one corridor, but a series of corridors that are connected together. That at the end of the day, we want them to be unified, but we don't necessarily want them to be uniform. They each reflect a different starting point. They each reflect their own culture, their own history, their own identity when we start thinking about making improvements to them in the future. Through those 1,000 touch points that came in online, offline, in person, over the phone, we got a lot of data points transmitted our way. And one of those was a dot exercise that we took all around the city and collected input on where we felt most safe and most comfortable, and those areas where we felt least safe and least comfortable. So the green is where people feel safest, and the pink, magenta, where they feel the least safe. So I'm going to shift a little bit to talk about this thing to my right. This beautiful installation that traveled all up and down the corridor with us. We call it the Testing Together Kit. And I want to give a special shout out, and then they're still here. Raise your hands. All right. Let's give it up for these guys. In about 10 days of time, they took a harebrained idea and developed concepts for it, secured the materials for it, built it while they were remodeling their house. Might I add, it's a huge lift. and delivered it, and then allowed us to borrow it and move it up and down the corridor, engaging hundreds of people where they're at as they are trying to use the corridor. So really appreciate the work you all did. Awesome work. One of the conversation pieces that we had while we were doing this is right along the back of this new bench that was created, where we had these simple icons and just asked people, you know, when you think about a comfortable corridor, when you think about the future of this corridor, what is the most important thing to you as you think about that future? And by far and away, it was really around the basics of human comfort, things like shade, things like a place to sit, things like a shelter while I wait for the bus. Those are the things that really came out of it, as well as sidewalks that are passive, that are predictable, and that are reliable as I move up and down the corridor. So while we're doing all the engagement and learning from the experts who use the corridor every day, we also were doing a lot of physical analysis, looking at data sets that have been aggregated over time to tell us a lot about how the corridor is and is not working from a more technical standpoint. And from that analysis, we were able to detect and kind of pull together where the areas of greatest need or greatest deficiencies within the street are located from a physical standpoint. Where are the intersections substandard? Where are sidewalks not occurring where they should? Things of that nature. And we were able to identify about 10 areas that had the kind of highest, most acute needs from a variety of vantage points. And where those vantage points started to intersect, that's where these spots started to locate. So when we think about the future, and we think about just our own experiences using a corridor, the way we typically think about it, in our world at least, is in kind of two primary lanes. One is routes. You know, how do I get from point A to point B? Is it manageable? Is it predictable? Is it reliable? Is it clear? And then the other piece is experience. What does it feel like to make that trip? What does it feel like to wait for that bus? What does it feel like to visit a neighbor down the street or go to the store around the corner? And when you think about walkability or making a corridor more livable or some of those other words that came out of this process, you really just can't do one or the other. You can't make just a great sidewalk, but make it right next to cars going 50 miles an hour. You can't just make a bus bench, but leave it exposed to days like we had this week. You got to think about both the stuff you build and the experience and the feeling that it generates. And the two have to work together if we're really going to move the needle on things like walkability. So we're going to think about the future of the corridor in both those respects. So when we think about the route, let's start with the route issues first. I mentioned a little bit of this at the opening. By far and away, the most important thing that we heard when it came to routes, again, how to get from point A to point B, was the lack of clarity, consistency, and reliability of the sidewalk network. In many areas, it just flat out doesn't exist. And in areas it does exist, it's either encumbered by trash, litter, overgrown weeds, crumbling, tripping hazards, things of that nature. Intersections aren't far behind. When I get to the intersection, the manageability of crossing that intersection is the second most problematic thing. So let's look at the corridor today. These orange thick lines represent where you do have sidewalks in one form or another. Again, we're just talking about the infrastructure, not necessarily the feeling of those sidewalks at this point. And what we're suggesting is that you start to fill in those gaps. Seems pretty basic, right? Fill in the gaps where we have room on the whole corridor for them. Let's finish the job of building our sidewalk network and connecting these neighborhoods. Now, one of the things that we look at when we do this kind of work is where are there sections of the roadway that are actually wider than they need to be. And there's an analysis that can actually be performed that demonstrates that in certain sections there are either more lanes than we need, or that the lanes are wider than we need, or that at intersections that turning movements are no longer needed to be dedicated, meaning that they have their own lane to make a left or a right. And so we can do some of that analysis. Some of that analysis is still going to have to happen, but areas that are rising up to the top of the list that we think are most eligible and conducive to this kind of response are these areas you see here. One in Albany Ball, one along the Bellevue corridor, and then parts of Cleveland itself. great thing is when you reduce some of the land area dedicated to travel lanes, that opens up more of the street for other uses, namely human uses, human comfort, trees, landscape, lighting, all of that. So one of the ways we're thinking of using some of that extra right-of-way is completing your trail network. So right now it's a tale of two cities. The northern end of the corridor to the right has a pretty intact cycle lane network that comprises the trail network up north. Nothing south of Peabody. So what we're suggesting through a different kind of design approach is to connect that network down to the south, all the way to Brooks. All right, so that's the route stuff. How do I get from point A to point B? You may be asking where buses come into this. I'm going to get to that. That's an important part of this. We put buses at the end because they're both experience and routes. So it's a little, I'm saving the best for last. So on the experience side, here we put up some images. I would say, by far and away, what we heard the most of and what we observed the most of, it's not that a lot of these conditions along the corridor are substandard or uncomfortable. They're downright degrading. And we should all feel a great deal of responsibility for actually addressing these things heads on. And the experience of walking up and down this corridor, riding it, sitting, waiting for a bus, chatting with friends, waiting to go to the shop before it opens, that kind of stuff, it's tough in a lot of parts of this corridor. And not necessarily one you would do by choice if you had other options. So we just documented some of those conditions along the way. One of the things that really contributes or takes away from the comfort of the street is the tree canopy. There are a lot of, Memphis is full of great neighborhoods with awesome tree canopy, but that somehow stops in many aspects along these corridors. So here you see in the thick green lines where the street tree canopy is the most robust and healthy. What we're suggesting is that there are opportunities on some of those gaps to smartly use some of that land that was reclaimed out of the road dining and use it for landscape and for tree canopy. Travel speed is also something that either can contribute to safety or a feeling of comfort or a positive experience or detract from it. Right now, this is largely a through corridor. This is a corridor that you really try to gun and get through as quickly as possible in many stretches. And that's in direct opposition to the neighborhood vitality, the retail, the businesses, the humans that are moving around these environments, to their comfort and their ability to be successful. And so here you got speeds that top off signed at 40 miles an hour, but in actuality, cars are moving much faster than that. And we think that there's an opportunity in some of these key areas to actually, both through design, which is critical to governing speed, as well as how we post and enforce it, to reduce the speed to 30 miles an hour, or even better, along Cleveland to 25 miles an hour as a kind of default setting. So I mentioned the buses. So these are all the bus stops up and down the corridor. Most of them are marked, although we found that not all of them are necessarily marked. And it's just amazing the density of transit service up and down this corridor. Really quite phenomenal. Through that process, I mentioned that physical analysis, we identified bus stops that had high ridership, but poor kind of human comfort qualities to them. And identified about a dozen or so bus stops that if you only had a few shelters, where would you deploy them to get the maximum benefit? But one thing that's really cool that we learned through this process is that there's a plan in place to actually elevate the bus experience and the level of service for this corridor. It's called the Crosstown Corridor Connector. And it's a bus rapid transit plan. The vehicles are already acquired, and there's a plan in place to actually improve what's called the headways, which means the frequency of the bus service, as well as the speed in which they can move up and down, because the number of stops actually shrinks and gets consolidated. You can see in these circles the areas where those stations might be consolidated. And what's cool about that is it starts to locate, you can see without exception, all of these upgraded stations taking place in locations where there's the highest need and poorest bus stop condition today. So that's pretty cool that that's already in the works, and then this plan and that plan are starting to intersect and leverage each other. Pretty powerful. So another thing to think about when it comes to experience is just the character of a place. Now this is a little bit outside of the kind of fringes of the scope of this work, but understanding the personality of these various stretches of street are absolutely critical when making design decisions about the future bus stops, trails, types of trees, types of signage, lighting. All of that is a character discussion. So in our words, we tend to think of these things as personalities of that place or personalities of that street. And I won't bore you with all the analysis and the thinking about it. We can talk about it around the room after, but we essentially identified 4 personality types up and down the corridor. These are personalities that in some places makes a lot of sense to just double down on and really be proud of and own and use as a filter for design decisions. But in other places, there are locations where the aspirational character of a place is totally out of touch with either the way the road functions today or just the built environment in general functions today. That we can actually transition that personality to something that is more aspirational and in line with what people are envisioning. All right, so I think Nick mentioned that we're going to have to be smart and creative and strategic about how we use our resources. It's a big corridor, there's unlimited funding, and so we have to think about prioritization. So the last bit of our work has been going through how we make decisions about prioritizing certain areas along the corridor. We can't do it all at once, and so we've got to be thoughtful about it. So the first thing that we looked at is something we call the leverage benefit analysis. And that's a kind of wonky statement, admittedly. But what that really means is if we make decisions or we make changes along a corridor, where does 1 + 1 start equaling 3, 5, 7, based on where we're making that investment? Are we allowing people to get to school easier? Are we close to a population density that will serve a lot of people? Is it connecting dots between 2 other infrastructure projects that, left to their own devices might result in a gap? These kinds of things start to factor into our thinking about how and where we think about our early phases of work. You can see in these black circles where going through that analysis and scoring these areas and these interventions start to paint kind of broad brush areas of focus where we might start. But it doesn't stop there. Early on in this process, we had a steering committee assembled, and we walked them through, and they gave us feedback on a prioritization exercise. And I forgot to call out this. Anybody from the steering committee here? Raise your hand. Anybody was on that? We've engaged them a lot this week, so they may be taking that out. And we walked through the prioritization exercise that said, okay, how should we evaluate and score projects based on what we care about? Weight the proposals impact based on those priorities. And so what the committee helped us do was to think about 3 tiers of priorities. So the first tier is all about improving safety. That should really be a surprise. The maximum number of people served based on how many people it connects locally. And then art and storytelling potential, which was kind of the biggest surprise. The ability to really elevate and celebrate the places along this corridor they want woven into every single project we think about, which is really cool. It doesn't always work out that way. The second tier of priorities were about striking an equitable geographic balance so that we're not just focused in the north or just focused in the south or the middle, but that we're getting fairly good distribution of investment. Willing and able local partners. It takes a lot of work to manage the implementation of a project. It takes even more work to make sure that it's safe and clean and operated appropriately. And who's going to be the squeaky wheel that calls the city at the end of, when a light goes bad or the garbage can is overflowing. Having these local partners is a huge need along a long corridor like this. And then, of course, cost eventually is going to come into the prioritization at some point. And then the tier 3 priorities were how fast can we get people moving through the corridor, and how many cars can we jam in the road. So that's going to be the lowest weighted factors when we look at the projects. Not unimportant, but not driving the ship. And so when we think about the corridor and the projects that we're starting to think about along it, all that prioritization leads to 3 areas of focus. And is layered these together on the map. We've highlighted that BRT map that I showed you. We've highlighted the kind of central station within each of those focus areas so we can start that conversation and advance that. And then we've run it through all of those proposed changes that we said need to be made along the corridor and talk about the character and type of improvements that would be made in that stretch. So the first area that we're looking at is in the south, Technology Falls area. The second is Bellevue, so the midsection. And then the third is about most of Cleveland up to the north. So what are we proposing in those areas? And we have the details all around the room that we look forward to talking to you about in just a second. So here's an existing kind of typical section of Watkins-Presley in the Alty-Ball neighborhood today. We've got 2 lanes going really fast in either direction, and then this kind of pavement material that just bleeds out into nothing, or into parking lots and into landscape. And what we're suggesting there is an opportunity to maintain those 2 lanes of traffic. It's a pretty heavily trafficked corridor for a lot of reasons. Start to introduce landscape, start to introduce some elements of lighting that can host community identity. So the Alty-Ball neighborhood, for instance, could have banners, flower pots, and things of that nature on there. Multimodal paths or wide sidewalks along either side, and then enough land along the corridor to host those elevated service bus stops for the BRT right along the street. In Bellevue, this is a section that's kind of odd. It gets constrained down to 2 lanes under the train tracks, but everywhere else it's 4 lanes. And so what we're suggesting here, this is an opportunity to actually keep that 2-lane section north of Southern Parkway to Lamar and beyond. And we're looking at a couple options here. I think kind of the universal aspiration is to reduce it down to 3 lanes, which can still handle a lot of traffic, but in a much more manageable and safe way. This option looks at a sidewalk or multi-use paths on one side. Again, you see the signage opportunities for Des Moines Owen or churches or other institutions along the way. This is a very institutional stretch of the corridor, as well as the BRT stations. And then in this alternative that we're thinking about, we're actually taking that multi-purpose path, making it a little smaller, but making it on both sides to supplement the sidewalk. And then up in Cleveland, we're also looking at a couple options here. So Cleveland's got a lot of different conditions along it. It's not just one thing. So we just showed one section as an example. Here you've got the bike lanes hugging the curb, and then you've got some degree of buffer depending on where you are, and a travel lane in each way with a central turn lane. And that's about how many trees are out there. And so in this alternative, what we're looking at is actually buffering and separating those cycle lanes from the moving traffic, maintaining that 3-lane section, creating enough room in the behind the curb area for those BRT facilities, introduce lighting, trees, and public art and identity into the streetscape. We also looked at another option where there may be opportunities to take that central turn lane out and put on-street parking where it would serve storefronts and businesses, in some cases homes, along. Everything else more or less remains the same. So before we break up, just the last couple things to think about. When you're dealing with the street, it's very easy to be myopic and think just about what happens between the curbs. The streets are one of those things that affect so many parts of our lives. And it's really hard for us as planners, designers, strategists, to stay within the lines and flow within the lines. And so we wanted to make sure that we didn't lose track of all the other things that are going to be essential for various partners, not just the city, to think about when thinking about the future of this corridor. The first is elevating what we call engagement and empathetic design. That kind of informs a process that doesn't end with tonight, but it is ongoing and continuing conversations, meeting people where they are, and making sure that the design team and the decision makers are as close to those who are going to live with those decisions as possible. It's really critical, and it's something that's ongoing, doesn't have a start and stop. Small area planning. Now, you guys are a bit ahead of the curve here because you've done the Memphis 3.0 and you've kind of started to think about some of the anchor areas or nodes along corridors like this one. But But as you start to introduce new ideas for what the street itself is going to become, that starts to afford new ways of thinking about some of those focus areas, for instance, that we thought about, new options for residential, retail, jobs, public space, things of that nature. And the small area plan is a great way to complement the investment in the street. When it comes time to building whatever it is that we're building, communication has to increase. And the level of correspondence and interactions with community members and people, commuters that are moving through the corridor and not expecting changes, that's got to increase. And the whole way that the process is branded and talked about and it's navigable is key to the success of these projects. And then management and care. I mentioned this a little bit before. You know, as a city or as a neighborhood organization, you can't just wait for an end user to complain or to find you. There's ways that we can be more proactive in actually getting out in front of things that we know are issues. Clearing the bike lanes, making sure the sidewalks are passable and not tripping hazards, making sure that signal timings are working for us, not against us. These are easy to fix problems in the grand scheme of things. We can't lose sight of those little basics that have a huge impact about the success and the health of the corridor. So with that, I'm going to stop, and we're going to design team, the planners in the city are going to be around the room. We'll hang out as long as it takes. I think the music's going to start again, so that's pretty cool. We got food, bathrooms around the rear, and yeah, is this a question about the process or about what we talked about? Okay, let's hold that. We'll be happy to talk to you after. All right, thanks everybody.